we're talking this afternoon about the Graduates and Apprenticeship Landscape, a quick overview. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Martin Birchall, the Managing Director of Fliers Research, who is the Research Director for our Employer Audit programme. And Martin is also an absolute expert in the graduate landscape, and Martin will very shortly be giving us a review of that landscape, as well as a bit later on taking us through the findings from the first 2 years of the Employer Audit programme, which also makes for some really interesting reading and listening. And we're also blessed to be joined by Anthony Knowles from the Department for Education, and what Anthony will be taking us through is a quick update on the statistics associated with the apprenticeship landscape. And then I'll conclude just with a quick overview of our Employer Audit programme in our 3rd year, in our 10th anniversary year, and I'll take you through the process for that very briefly. Hopefully many of you will have heard and seen of that before, but for some of you I know it's new. Just a bit of housekeeping. You'll all have noticed as you joined that this afternoon's event is recorded. There's a number of reasons for that. One is some of us are of a certain age, so we can remember what we've said through the process. But actually, it allows us to show this to other people as we go through, and for you to have a record of what we discussed. You'll have noted that your video is off and that you've been muted. So if you have any points or questions you'd like to raise, if you could put those into chat, and my colleagues Helen and Jill will be looking at chat and feeding the elements through to us throughout this afternoon. And also when it comes to the questions and answers at the end, we'll have a rich seam of information. And just so you're aware, there's a number of links and references through this afternoon. And Jill and Helen will also be seeding into the chat the various links so that you've got those at your disposal as we go through. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'll hand over to Martin Birchall, as I say, from Fliers, and Martin will take us through the graduate landscape. Martin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. Just give me a moment while I queue up my slides. Let me do some sharing. Excellent. So, Mark, thank you very much for your generous introduction. Fliers Research has been researching the graduate job market now for nearly 3 decades. We started in the mid-1990s, and I've lost track of how many recessions and downturns we've worked through. But I think it's probably fair to say our day job is looking at what it is that university students go on to when they leave university. So each year we conduct the UK Graduate Careers Survey. It's based on face-to-face interviews with final year students at many of the country's best known universities. We then have partnered with the Times newspaper for the last 25 years to produce a guide to the country's top employers. So that looks at the most sought after graduate employers, and it's based on the research that we do for the UK Graduate Careers Survey. And then, having spent most of the year looking at what it is that students expect to go on to, we have a check and balance twice each year to see exactly what it is that employers are offering in terms of their graduate vacancies, the starting salaries, and perhaps most interesting, what they're looking for when they're recruiting their new graduates. So it's these 3 pieces of research that we'll be looking at over the next 20 minutes or so. Just in terms of some more background on Fliers Research, though, we're really proud to be partnering now with the Department for Education to produce the top 100 apprenticeship employers, and of course with the 5% Club to deliver the employer audit as well. And as of this year, we have a major programme which goes out to schools called Graduate Careers Live, which brings careers guidance into the 6th form, offering year 12 and year 13 pupils an insight in terms of what the graduate job market and what degree apprenticeships look like for some of their post-18 choices. So I mentioned that we conduct our survey each year. We do it on behalf of around about 70 of the country's biggest and best known graduate employers. And we're very pleased to be working with 4 or 5 of the biggest employers in each of the key sectors. So whether it's accounting and professional services, the big public sector employers, top city law firms, investment banks, the big oil and energy companies, consumer goods companies, right the way through to the armed forces, and elsewhere in areas like the media. So it's a very broad cross-section of different types of employers, but they come together because they're keen to understand what's the latest outlook for students just about to launch themselves on the graduate job market. So our latest survey took place in February of this year. We based it at 32 key universities around the country. And these are chosen on the basis that they're the most often targeted by the largest national and international employers. So when it comes to local careers events, whether it's careers fairs, presentations, other local initiatives, it's these 32 universities which get the most attention from year to year. So geographically, a broad spread. So starting with 5 of the London colleges, Oxford and Cambridge, Surrey and Southampton across the south, 4 universities in the West Country and over in Wales, a good selection across the Midlands, the Northeast, the Northwest of England, 4 universities in Scotland, including Aberdeen, and then Queen's University, Belfast over in Northern Ireland. And we have our own student network, so a university manager based at each of these universities who puts together a local team of up to 45 interviewers so that for 2 very busy weeks in February, we can conduct the survey simultaneously around the country. So at the very largest universities, we'd be interviewing 700 or 800 students. Some of the smaller universities like Aston or Bath, it would be around the 200 or 300 mark. And the intention is, in each case, we're getting a representative sample of all the different faculties and subjects that students may be studying. So this year's sample, 13,309, representing about 1 in 6 of those who are graduating from those universities. So we start the survey with a very straightforward question. We ask students, what do they plan to do after university? And this gives us our sense of partly how confident students are, but also what their practical plans are as well. So this year, 29% thought they'd be starting a full-time graduate job. We have another 16% who thought they'd be looking for a graduate position. And that gives us 45% in total who are aiming for the graduate job market. Now, bearing in mind, we're talking about some of the most sought after universities in the country. This may strike you as a low proportion, but it is one of the higher figures we've seen in recent years. There's another 4% who think they'll be taking some other form of work. And this includes those who perhaps had little or no work experience and are keen to get some work experience before they apply to graduate programs. Now, it's interesting, if I go back to the 16%, those who think they'll be looking for work, at the point we talked to them in February, there's about 12 weeks to go before they graduate. And in many cases, students have made lots of applications during their final year, hoping to get a place on a graduate program or get their first job offer. But by the time we talked to them in February, they've had nothing but rejections. And that means that they're back potentially competing for a job towards the end of the cycle over the summer after graduation. But there are around half of this group now who deliberately sit out of the job search, believing that what they need to be successful is to get a first or a 2-1, so they're focusing on their degree result first. Our final category for employment, though, is those who expect to run their own business. And this year, just 2% thought they'd be self-employed after university. And almost all of them were students who'd started a business during their time at university. So it's not a question of them launching something new. They've already been doing it alongside their studies. But you can see from the pie chart, we're barely halfway around. So it means that this year, almost as many students heading away from the job market as planned to join it. The next most popular option, well, postgraduate study is an option for over a quarter of the class of 2023. Around half are doing it for what you might think of as genuine career reasons. Those who perhaps going on to law school, they're going off to teacher training, they might be doing a postgrad for their engineering qualifications. But the other half are doing it because they haven't worked out what it is they need to do next. So for them, an extra year's worth of study gives them some additional thinking time. Now, bearing in mind all of the disruption and misery of the pandemic, no chance for travel, no chance for lots of the normal student experiences, no surprise that 1 in 10 would like to take time off and go traveling. But sadly, this year, that left us with 12% who, being questioned about 3 months before their end of university, simply had no idea what was going to happen next. And this is the group that everybody worries about, because they're no less able than the other portions in the pie chart. These are students who are going to come away with very good academic qualifications, but they haven't decided what they're going to do. They haven't been making applications to employers, and in many cases, they haven't engaged with the careers process while they've been at university. So does it make a difference which university you're at? Well, these results would suggest it does. You can see top left, the likes of Loughborough, Surrey, Aston, Queen Mary in London, LSE, Warwick, Bath, all at least half of their students going on to the graduate job market. So the national average 45%, some much higher figures here. And what most of these universities have in common on that top left-hand side is they have very strong relationship with employers. Work experience is often built into the degree courses. So for the likes of Bath or Aston or Surrey or Loughborough, most students there are having a chance of a placement year as part of their degree. But what do we make of the universities on the right-hand side? So the likes of Oxford and Cambridge on that right-hand side, Bristol and Glasgow, only 34% of their graduates expecting to join the graduate job market. Well, conversely, these universities have some of the highest proportions going on to further study. So their graduates will make it into the job market. It's just going to take a little bit longer. And is there a difference depending on what students have studied? Well, the most confident students are those studying engineering, computer science, those interested who've been studying business and management. Somewhere upwards of 50% of those students expecting to start a graduate job. But the figures at the bottom there, you can see just how low they are for things like arts and humanities and languages. Fewer than 2/5 of students from those subjects believe they will get a graduate job. And of course, it's ironic because 70% of graduate jobs in the UK, it doesn't matter what you've studied. So there's no reason for students in those faculties to feel disadvantaged or to feel that they have fewer employers targeting them. But the reality is, this is certainly not a new result. We see most years that those doing arts and humanities and languages are amongst the least confident when it comes to their career prospects. So what is it the class of 2023 want to do when they leave university? Well, the top choice in terms of the numbers who've applied for different job areas, consulting is the most popular. Nearly 1 in 5 want to work in consulting. 1 in 7 off to hoping to join the media, whether that's broadcasting or journalism or advertising, and then a similar proportion off to work in marketing. Now, it's really interesting that this bears no resemblance to where the jobs actually are in the UK. If these numbers are right, the 1 in 7 who are off to work in the media, that would suggest over 50,000 of this year's graduates nationally applying for jobs in things like broadcasting and advertising. Whereas in reality, we're struggling to find even 500 paid graduate roles. Lots of unpaid internships still, lots of opportunities to get short-term work experience on things like a film set or a TV company, but very, very few paid graduate roles available. And then if you look to the bottom of the left-hand side there, accountancy, which is currently the largest private sector recruiter of graduates, doesn't even make this year's top 10. So fewer than 8% of this year's graduates applying for jobs in accountancy. And on the right-hand side, it gets even tougher for employers in the retail sector, for example. Only 3% of this year's graduates applying for jobs within the sector. So we check within the survey what it is that students plan to do after they graduate and ask them a series of practical questions about their first job, including what sort of organisation would they like to join. You can see here very nearly half would like to join a major national or international employer. And this is largely down to the perception of better starting salaries, perhaps higher quality training and development, and for some, the allure of a name that's recognisable on their CV at the start of their career. 1 in 5, though, happy to join a small or medium-sized firm, and 1 in 7 off to join the government or a public sector organisation. We ask where in the country new graduates would like to work, and this result never changes. The answer is always London. This year, very nearly half said that they wanted to work in the capital. And again, the students will list a whole series of reasons. Again, it can include higher starting salaries, better choice of employment, a chance to keep up with all their friends who are moving to London as well. But it does mean that the numbers applying for jobs in other parts of the country are disproportionately low. So 7% aiming for the Northwest, 6% for the Midlands. And in reality, only 25% of graduate jobs are within the M25. So it means by definition, the majority of graduates will find themselves working further afield. We do check each year how much in terms of starting salaries new graduates expect to earn. And you can see in the period following the last big recession in 2008, 2009, it's been a steady increase, but just a few £100s each year. So in the decade from 2010 up until 2020, expectations have jumped by around £3,500. But you can see just in these last 2 years, a very, very strong growth, a combination of the cost of living. People well aware that there have been generous wage settlements across both private and public sector. So it has pushed students' expectations much, much higher. So more than a £3,000 jump in just 2 years, comparing 2021 and 2023. And there are some very significant differences by university. So those coming out of the likes of Imperial College, the London School of Economics, they're expecting over £35,000 as an average starting salary. It means that 1 in 3 of their graduates now expect to earn at least £40,000 when they start work. And for Imperial, a high percentage going off to work at some of the top engineering employers, things like the oil industry, also working in consulting, and for those at LSE, many of them choosing investment banking or law for their first job. So some very high salaries on offer. But at the lower end, you can see there's more than a £10,000 gap between top and bottom, the likes of Liverpool and Newcastle expecting around 24 or 25,000. And it's interesting, we always, when we're feeding this back to universities and back to students, we always remind them it's a national jobs market. There's no reason, if you're studying in the Northwest or the Northeast, why you should earn anything less when you start as a graduate. But these figures do seem to reflect local salaries being lower in some of those regions. We do check what it is that students expect from their first job and give them a series of statements and ask how important this is to them. And it's something we've tracked over a number of years. Having a good social life through work, that's been top last year and this year. And I think that's a reflection really of just how dismal the student experience was through much of the pandemic. But it's interesting this year that not working evenings or weekends is now the second highest priority, and that's never happened before. So it feels like there's been a real change in terms of attitudes this year. We have seen that giving something back has become a real thing, particularly over the last 5 years. And at the peak of the pandemic, that was right up as the second most popular feature for students' first jobs. A couple of aspects post-pandemic, the idea of being able to work from home and where should you be based? Well, the majority of new graduates definitely want to be based in the office or on site. They don't want to be stuck at home. They've had 3 or 4 years of that dominated by being stuck doing online learning for much of their degrees. And only one in 5 say it's important to them that they should be able to work at home for some of the time. So home working seems to still be a contentious issue nationally, more popular with those who've been in work for some time, much less popular for those who need to learn from others by being in the office. And we do ask students, how on earth do they bring all these different factors together when it comes to deciding who to apply to? So content of work, the quality of the training program are two of the key things when it comes to decision making. But starting salary and benefits, that's now in the top 5. That's the first time that's happened. Work-life balance up there as well. And lots of focus on employers doing the right thing. So being committed to diversity, being environmentally friendly and eco-conscious as well. And then a cheeky question just to finish off the survey. What do students expect to do by the age of 30? That being one of the really big milestones 8 or 9 years after leaving university. The numbers you can see they're expected to own their own house or flat, just over half. That's dropped from 78% 5 years ago. As the property market gets tougher, the numbers aspiring to home ownership has dropped significantly. Fewer students this year expecting to be married or starting a family. Lots of aspiration for overseas experiences, living and working in different countries, or failing that, just lots of holidays. You'll see a few lines down. And no particular loyalty to the first employer they join. Over a quarter think they'll have worked for at least 3 different organisations in the 8 or 9 years after leaving university. And no lack of ambition. If you think back to the original pie chart, only 45% expecting to join the job market. You can see nearly half of those think they'll be earning 100,000 a year by the time they reach 30. But it's not all bluster. There is one very sad line on there, 3 lines up from the bottom. 18% think they'll have repaid their student debts and loans. And it is just a reminder that the cost of being at university is the highest it's ever been. So the average student debts are now reaching 43,000. And bearing in mind that 60% of students have help from their families or relatives in terms of having their tuition fees paid or help with their cost of living. Even with all of that, the average debt is still £43,000. So that's a quick glimpse at the outlook for the class of 2023. Let's have a look at who the top employers are. If we just whiz through some of our latest rankings, some new entries from MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, a new entry from Mercedes-Benz, the car company, a really high new entry for Channel 4 Television, just echoing how popular the media is, and the highest new entry of the year, the law firm DLA Piper. A really good result for the Unlocked graduate scheme. That's bringing graduates to work as prison officers after university. That's jumped nearly 50 places to just outside the top 20. And then within the top 10, these are the most sought after employers for 2023. The highest ever ranking for Barclays, they're at number 10. No change for the retailer Aldi, £45,000 starting salary and a fully expensed electric car. Does encourage lots of applicants each year. About 27,000 people applied for 110 jobs last year. It's a trainee area manager program. So for those who are successful, they're responsible for 4 of their stores by the end of the first 12 months. No change at number 8, the first of the big accounting firms, KPMG. Number 7, the best known of the media employers, the BBC, recruiting between 50 and 100 onto their higher and degree level apprenticeship programs each year. No change at number 6, EY, the next of the accounting firms. And number 5, no change for Google either. They're recruiting around 400 graduates each year for posts in London and Dublin. No change at 4, another of the big 4 accounting firms, Deloitte, recruiting around 1,500 graduates in 2023. They made it as high as number 2 in the worst of the pandemic, the NHS, now down to number 3. And this is a reflection of all of their management and finance and HR jobs that they have available as distinct from all of the health professional roles. And last year's number 1 is down 1 place to number 2, the civil service, best known for its fast stream scheme, number 1 for the previous 4 years. But PwC, the largest of the big 4 accounting and professional services firms, they've been number 1 15 years in a row up until 2018, and they're back on the top spot for this year. So finally, across all of those 100 employers, how many graduates are they recruiting? Well, if we look at our latest snapshot, the trend over the last 15 years has generally been upwards, a really big dip in the worst of the recession in 2008, 2009, a long slow recovery, another dip after the Brexit vote in 2017, a plunge in vacancies in 2020 at the start of the pandemic, but a really rapid recovery since then, and recruitment is at an all-time high. Within the sectors, I mentioned earlier, the accounting and professional services firms lead the way, over 7,500 vacancies across the different firms there. And in terms of starting salaries, well, it's been entirely stagnant for much of the last decade, but just in the last 2 seasons, the number of jobs surging and the salary levels are increasing too. So 33,500 is the average starting salary across the top employers. The banks are leading the way, the law firms not far behind, and the big consulting firms on 45,000. And interesting that 1 in 3 of those graduates are now being recruited through work experience programs. So something which has changed the pattern of recruitment on campus, certainly. And in certain sectors, it's become the main route in. And then finally, just a reminder of how competitive it is to get a graduate job at some of these organisations. The average is nudging 40 applications per graduate vacancy. For the likes of the oil and energy companies, the big consumer goods manufacturers, it can be anything up to 5 or 6 times that number. So there we are, a whistle-stop tour through the graduate landscape, a glimpse of what the class of 23 are looking for, the latest countdown from the top 100 graduate employers, and the latest stats in terms of what the country's top employers say they're recruiting for 2023. Back to you, Mark.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Martin. And it's triggered a number of questions already. And Helen has gone back into chat to just remind everybody that you'll be taking those questions at the end. And I know there was one question that was around degree apprenticeships, which is actually a really neat segue into our next presenter, Anthony Knowles from the DFE, who will talk about all things apprenticeships and maybe touch on degree apprenticeships. So Anthony, over to you. I think you might be muted, Anthony.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Got you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Anthony Knowles, Head of Employer Insight at Department for Education. Great to speak to those people who know me and also to anybody who doesn't. Nice to meet you. I'm going to give you a quick update in terms of the latest data and insights on the apprenticeship market. And I wanted to start by just talking about the apprenticeship program objectives. So it's about supporting employers of all sizes to benefit from high quality apprenticeships that actually meet the skills needs and economic priorities that you've got. But there's a real emphasis now, particularly in terms of our new Minister, Robert Halfon, on driving up the quality. And so ensuring all of those apprentices who are already on programme achieve, and also anybody who starts has the best chance of achieving at the end. And that's really important in terms of the employers who are sponsoring those apprentices, because it's proven that you get the greatest return on investment if your apprentices complete and stay with your organisation beyond their apprenticeship, perhaps progress on to something else. So we have this ambition to have an achievement rate of 67% by 24-25. When I show you the data, you'll see we've got quite a long way to go. But I wanted to flag up that letter that Minister Halfon had sent to the sector recently. So this was published in March, and a link will be provided, talking very much about achievement, sharing some additional data and insight around it. And so it's well worth you perusing that following on from this session if you're interested. So just to go through the latest data, this is 6 months. It's all published information. It's August to January, and the comparisons are with the same time period in previous years. So in terms of the main measures for the programme, apprenticeship starts are slightly down, 4% down compared with last year. But fairly significantly up compared with 2021. Now, obviously, we've got the impact of the pandemic here. So in 2021, starts were deflated considerably. But also, we've still got a kind of legacy of that in terms of incentives were still available during 21-22. So that perhaps slightly inflated the numbers during August to January in that academic year. So we feel like we're doing not too badly in terms of starts holding up. They're starting to recover post-pandemic. And also that's reflected in participation, which is continuing to go up. That is partly because the mix and balance of the programme has changed slightly. So we have slightly less at lower levels, slightly more at higher levels. They tend to be longer. And so people who are actually participating in the programme does continue to rise in part due to that. Then lastly on achievements, I did paint a slightly bleak picture a minute ago, but the volume of achievements has gone up. Again, this is a post-pandemic thing because there are a lot of learners who had a break in learning or perhaps there was some sort of interruption due to the pandemic. And so that did affect volumes in the last couple of years. But encouragingly, they're up by 21.8%. So yeah, it's looking fairly positive in terms of volumes. So just to go into those into a little bit more detail, we've got a breakdown here by age and level of the starts. And as you can see, a similar volume of under 19, slightly more in percentage terms. So more opportunities being created for the really young people who start apprenticeships. 19 to 24 is down just slightly on both counts. So now a slightly lower share of the starts, 29.6% compared with 31% last year. And 25 plus it's broadly static, so just a slight change in terms of volumes and percentages. But I mean, contrary to some of the coverage you see sometimes in the press, we do still see that under 25s represent the bulk of the programme. So 58% of all starts, even in the current academic year, have been for under 25s. And in terms of levels, we continue to see this decrease in intermediate level starts. So they're now representing 23.5% of starts, just 46,000 so far this year. That has gone down. Advanced is broadly the same. So 43% of the programme, and higher are increasing from a lower baseline, but they have increased so much over the years. They're proving really popular, both in terms of hiring young people, but also in terms of existing staff upskilling or actually getting accreditation for their skills. So but still, level 2 and 3 starts count for just over 2/3 of the programme. So it is still dominated by those lower levels. Then in terms of learner characteristics, so ethnic minorities now represent 14.7% of the starts. That's increasing, so in terms of share and volume. So we're particularly keen to widen participation to those underrepresented groups, and similarly learners with who are declaring a learning difficulty, that's up 14 to 14.9% of the starts, compared to 13.8 and 12.1 in the previous 3 years. So again, we're widening participation, reaching out to people who previously wouldn't have accessed apprenticeships, which is a really positive thing in terms of the diversity of people entering the programme. Not doing so well in terms of people from the most deprived areas. That's gone slightly down to 19.9% of all starts. So a bit of a volume fall there, perhaps some work to do in terms of attracting people from those areas. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, starts at higher levels, particularly increasing. Level 6 and 7 are particularly strong, so they're up 11.1%. It's 7.1% up in terms of higher levels overall. And then STEM subjects as well, they represent 1/3 of starts, and we're also seeing a really positive increase in terms of STEM starts by females, which is another priority of our minister. Thinking about participation then, just a little bit more detail behind those figures. So I mentioned it had gone up, but there you can see the breakdown by the different levels. It is slightly down at intermediate levels, as people have moved away from those, well, in some cases frameworks where they were not replaced by a standard, but people are increasingly looking to recruit at advanced and higher levels. So advanced is staying about the same in terms of participation, but there is quite a growth in terms of higher apprenticeships. Then on achievements, so a little bit more detail on that 21% growth. All levels are growing in terms of the volume of achievements, and particularly the case in higher apprenticeships. They tend to be longer, and so we do now have a reasonable stock of people who are on them who are coming to the end. But as I did say, do be slightly wary of those increases, because we had things like breaks in learning, delays to endpoint assessments that were caused by the pandemic in the years or two before. So still plenty of work to do there. And so I wanted to highlight the achievement rates. So we publish these annually. They are published at provider level. And a headline rate, the overall achievement rate for 21-22, so this is looking back to the last full academic year that we have data for, it was down by 4.3%. There is something that skews that slightly in that we did have a greater proportion of frameworks. So we had a great proportion of apprentices who was working towards frameworks. Those who are left on those because they've been discontinued are much more likely to achieve than people who are starting on the new standards, and as they get gradually introduced. And so it's kind of comparing apples with pears when you look at previous years. But if we look at the achievement rate just for standards, which is all new starts now on apprenticeships, they've gone down very slightly. We feel like, you know, considering the pandemic, the things that I've mentioned already about delays and interferences with learners, that, you know, that's reasonably positive, and we should start to see those rates increase. But we've got an awful long way to go to get to the 67% ambition for 24-25. And there's just a note there about retention rates as well. So I did want to just flag up as I finish a couple of useful resources. So the Apprenticeship Achievements document there has got all sorts of additional data, detailed breakdowns of the latest achievement rates, data on positive destinations, apprentice satisfaction, and the reasons for non-completion. So if there's anything you can do to help overcome some of those barriers, they're all detailed in there. Also the employer step-by-step guide, which has got lots of useful resources on employer responsibilities, finding the right course and provider, and supporting apprentices. And last but not least, if you want to network with your peers, the top 100 apprenticeship employers is a very good reference point. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony. And just to clarify for those of you who've joined the webinar and have all of a sudden found yourself in a briefing around graduates and apprenticeships, that is the purpose of this afternoon. But now we're going to move into the final section where we're going to do a quick review of the last 2 years of the employer audit before just outlining the steps on how to participate in this year's audit. So Martin, over to you for a really quick review of where we are with the findings from the first 2 years of the audit. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I can do really quick. Just let me go with my slides. So Mark will be explaining a little bit more shortly about this year's employer audit, but we've had 2 previous employer audits, and we thought a really nice way to introduce what the year ahead brings would be just to share with you some of the key findings from those first 2 audits. And we have produced just a quick review document, which we'll be sharing later in the week, so you can see some of the detail there. But just a few of the headlines for you. So the 5% Club Employer Audit was set up to provide employers within the club a chance to benchmark with some of the other key employers and to see just how close or otherwise they were to the 5% commitment that they made when they joined the club. So we were really pleased that for the first audit in 2021, we had 73 employers take part. The most recent one in 2022, that jumped to 129. And it's a balance between larger employers, those with more than 250 employees, and SMEs. So larger employers, 52 in 2021, growing to 85 last year, 21 SMEs, more than doubling to 44 in 2022. Now, across the audit, there are 5 things that the audit is measuring. So it's looking at the overall employment levels for earn and learn roles, the breadth and balance of those opportunities. So whether or not employers are offering opportunities for apprentices, for graduates, for placement students, or other opportunities. How inclusive and diverse are those opportunities? The audit also looks at the quality, so how many apprentices, graduates and students complete their training, and the other quality assurance that employers are providing, and what is there in terms of plans for future growth. So each of those 5 aspects contribute to the employer audit. So if we look at those in turn, the results over the last 2 years show us that Firstly, just in terms of the volume of opportunities available, well, in 2021, the employers who took part in the audit offered just over 86,000 earn as you learn roles. That grew to over 93,000 in 2022. And you can see there is a whole range. So for some of the smallest employers, just a handful of earn as they learn employees, but for 17 of the largest organizations last year, they had at least 500 opportunities. And one of the key outputs from the audit is to measure the percentage. So that leads to the award of either a bronze, silver or gold membership of the 5% club. You can see there that those above the 5% threshold, the number of golds awarded increased from 58 in 2021 to 107 in 2022. So what sort of earn and learn opportunities have 5% members been providing? Well, the biggest grouping are the apprenticeships. So that accounts for around 2/3 of all of the opportunities. The numbers you can see there, almost 40,000 apprenticeships available from those who took part in the audit in 2022. And there has been growth in most of the different levels of apprenticeship available. So level 3 and those at levels 4 to 7 and above, more apprenticeships on offer from 5% club members in 2022 compared to the previous year. Slightly fewer level 2 opportunities, a similar number of graduate roles year to year, and similar numbers of degree placement students as well. So what about inclusion and social mobility? Well, each employer who takes part in the audit is asked to share their profile, so by gender, by ethnic background, by age, and a number of other indicators. I have to say it's more of a challenge for apprenticeships in terms of gender balance. It's very roughly an 80-20% split between men and women. In terms of ethnic background, around 1 in 10 are from an ethnic minority, and the majority of those who are starting apprenticeships with 5% club employers are under 25. Potentially a more diverse profile for the graduates recruited, so roughly 2/3, 1/3 ratio for men versus women, 1 in 5 from an ethnic minority, and a slightly higher proportion from low-income families. The next indicator is quality, and Anthony talked there about the number of completions from apprenticeships. Well, it is a challenge right across the a healthy number of employers within the 5% club who have had either 90 or 100% success rates. So some very high scores in both of the years for the employer audit, and an even higher success rate for graduate programs. Well over 50 employers last year reporting that their graduate programs were generating 100% success rate. And then finally, the outlook for the year ahead in terms of growth. Well, 2021 was the year following the pandemic, so most employers had cut back the previous year and were expecting it to expand their apprenticeships and their graduates as things return to normal. The response in 2022, still very healthy growth, more employers increasing their programs compared to those who were cutting back, but it was a more normal growth level with the worst of the pandemic behind them. So all of this is summarized in just a short introductory report on the employer audit, and it's a great way just to launch the 2023 employer audit. So I'm going to hand back to Mark and he can explain what we're doing for this year.
Thank you so much, Martin. As Martin said, the précis of the findings from the first 2 years will be available at the end of this week, and that will help you get the broader perspective on where we are, coupled, of course, with the fantastic insights we've had so far this afternoon on the graduate market and the apprenticeship market. For the 93 of you who have persevered with us this afternoon, thank you. We've got about another 5 to 10 minutes to go where I just outline the employer audit process to you, and then we'll take your Q&A. Just to start off on the employer audit, those of you who have been with the 5% club for some time will know that the current skills minister, Robert Halfon, It's been a great supporter of the 5% Club, but as indeed has the Secretary of State for Education. And this is a quote from the current Secretary of State, Gillian Keegan, who was very supportive of the 5% Club, and indeed was the catalyst behind the Department for Education joining the club, going through the process last year, and indeed being awarded gold in the 2023 audit process. The aim of the audit process, as you'll have worked out through the course of this afternoon, we want to give employers recognition for everything they do. But what we want to do is, where some programs stop in terms of the recognition, that's where we feel the employer audit process starts and complements the data you've heard from the other sources this afternoon. So what you get from the audit, which you don't get in many other places, is benchmarking research that shows you the overall context along the lines of what Martin has just talked about, but actually shows you where you are as an employer. And what we found through that process is actually that the questions you answer, and indeed sometimes the questions you don't answer, can give you a great benchmark. And what we found, for instance, is lots of people have struggled with the inclusion social mobility data and have been unable to answer. When they get their benchmark report back, it shows that actually they're alongside the other 50% of participants who couldn't answer those kind of questions, which is a great way to go back into the business and say, you know what, it'd be great if we could do this, but we're not alone. We're not an outlier. Actually, quite a lot of people struggle with that data. And then the other element we always go through with the process, as well as the recognition, is the annual awards process. And last year we launched the UK Employer Earn and Learn Awards, which when you enter the audit process, it's an automated entry. There's no further subjective data you need to put in. And those awards are presented later in the year at our celebration event. So you get quite a lot for quite a low outlay, both in terms of cost, but most importantly, in terms of the time you need to put in. Martin's mentioned the 5 axes we go through on the employer audit. I won't go through those again. But what we do is we have a simple questionnaire. And the questionnaire that we go through, I've shared an example of it here. There's 10 questions. Those of you who've entered the apprenticeship top 100, you'll be familiar with many of these questions because you answer 5 very similar questions as you go through the top 100 apprentice employer or the top 50 SME apprentice employers. But these questions, there's no sleight of hand. It's all open book. And what we've tried to do is develop a questionnaire that takes no more than about 3 hours to complete in terms of getting the data and putting and answering the questions. And they're all fairly self-explanatory. Like I say, you get this questionnaire and it allows you to work through. But most importantly, when you start the process, if you're really focused on the bronze, silver, gold, or indeed this year platinum membership, you can work out yourself whether you've got that just by looking at the percentage of your earn and learners as a percentage of the overall workforce. And if that's above 5%, then you're very much in the gold category. So that's the questionnaire. And like I say, Jill and Helen will probably put that in chat, and we'll send you the links to that after the event if you've not got that at this stage. The recognition, you get these logos. We've actually seen participants in the first 2 rounds now have actually started to put that on their corporate letterheads in company reports, or indeed on their vehicles, and that's a great indictment. And someone asked a question in the chat about, how does some of the top graduate employers fare in terms of recognition? Well, your Aldis and your Lidls are actually down in the bronze because their overall volume of earn and learn is quite low. But there's no right or wrong answer. This is about recognition of where you are and how you'd like to grow. And this year we've introduced a new category, which is the Platinum Award, which is awarded to those employers who've been gold for 3 years and have actually got the volume above 10%. So those awards are made to you. You'll find out what the award is in sort of late September, October, but we ask that you sit on that until we make the announcements, and I'll give you the process for that in a moment. The research report is very fulsome, and this is a sample report. But what you get is you get all the usual sort of preamble, but as Martin showed, you start to get some examples of where you sit. And this is a good example of the benchmarking that shows an overall volume of apprentices, employees in Earn and Learn, and how that sits in terms of comparison to others in percentage terms. And actually what you find is some of the large employers with large volumes of Earn and Learners actually in percentage terms is actually comparatively quite low. And there's five chapters. All of this is laid out, and again, this sort of positioning is unique to the audit. You know your data because you've answered the questions, but actually the comparison is the rich component of that. So that's the research report, and again, we'll be sharing the example of the generic report with you in chat. The findings of the process are brought alive in our symposium, which is an online event, very similar to what you've seen this afternoon, but actually it goes all the way through the employer audit data and lets you know exactly where you stand and how others, and it's a great opportunity to interrogate the information provided. And then backed up with a celebration event. This year will be at Mansion House on the 29th of November. You can see in the past, as well as Gillian Keegan photobombing last year's awards, previous year we had Robert Halfon give the keynote speech. It's a great opportunity to network with everybody across the sector who's participated, and also meet the great and the good in the world of apprenticeships. And for those who are award winners, to also receive your award. So in terms of next steps, it's relatively simple. Applications are now open for the employer audit for this year. Once you've applied, a link is sent to you from Fliers, and the research then starts into July and August. You go through the research, like I say, it takes 3 hours. You're phoned up by one of the researchers from Fliers just to validate your entry. You then hopefully go away on summer holidays or whatever. You come back, and whilst you've been away, Fliers have been processing all the reports, and you get your award and your report back in September, October timeframe, just ahead of the symposium. We go through the symposium on the 9th of November, and then you're invited to the celebration event at Mansion House on the 29th of November, where great chance to have a few nibbles, glass of bubbles, compare notes with other people, and to find out where you stand in the overall Earn and Learn awards. So it's come to that time of this afternoon's event where we can now open to questions, and I see we've got quite a few questions, but I'll leave it to my colleague Jill to let us know what the questions are, and then we'll work out who's best placed to answer them. Jill, will we?
I think it's going to be Helen, actually, Mark. So I'll hand to Helen.
Mark, the first one, and I think you might, apologies if you've answered some of these, I've been doing stuff behind the scenes. Does the survey have any information on when students start applying for graduate programmes?
So that's a good graduate question. I'll pass that to Martin, who's probably best placed for that one.
So our survey of our 13,000 who graduating this summer tells us exactly month by month when they've made applications for graduate jobs. So half of those graduating this summer started their careers research in their first year. Only 20% left it till their final year. The peak months this year were between November and February. So in each of those 4 months, they had the highest volume of applications. And that's a little bit later than pre-pandemic. So if we look at the 3 or 4 years building up to the pandemic, more students applied in September or October. Now it's a little bit further into the cycle. So I hope that gives you a flavour.
And thanks, Martin. Another one, which I personally thought was quite interesting. Can we include those on skills boot camps in our audit return?
So we don't use those on skills boot camps, because skills boot camps are generally a shorter course, which we don't count because we look at longer courses. That said, we do ask questions about wider participation in terms of T-level work placement. Skills boot camps was actually mentioned on the questionnaire, and we capture that data. But workplace learning for us is apprenticeships, grad schemes, and what we loosely term sponsored students, which is somebody released from a longer course of education to do a work placement. And of course, that education can run in parallel to that work placement, but it's usually for an academic year. But it's open to interpretation, as we recognise there's lots of qualifications in that space.
Thanks, Mark. And another one here, which I think ties in with some research report we've recently been working on. Top 100, it would be interesting to know if they meet the 5%. So I guess it's more a comment rather than a question, but you might want to reference some of that recent research that we've been partnering on.
Yes, so I alluded to that in my part of the presentation there, which is the graduate recruitment. You know, the top 100. There's a number of companies that are favoured as a destination by graduates, but actually, when you look at an overall volume, their overall volume of graduates and apprentices is below the 5% threshold. And of course, we exist to encourage employers to go for 5% of the volume. And what you find is a number of historically graduate-only employers are now starting to embrace an expansion into apprenticeships. And it goes sector by sector. So retail is historically bad in terms of volumes of workplace learners, as we know.
And I think most probably the final one, because of timing, are people on T-level placements included? I'm assuming this is in the audit, even though they aren't employed.
We ask questions about T-level placements because they're not an earn and learner, then they don't count to the overall volume. That said, we recognise the proximity of T-levels to apprenticeships, and we would encourage obviously employers to embrace T-levels and offer those work experience programs, particularly as T-levels come of age and continue to expand.
That's all the questions I think we have time for, given it's 14:59, so I'll leave it there.
Fabulous. Thanks ever so much, Helen. And I do note that the number of participants is dropping off as we get to the 1400 witching hour. Thanks to those who left early and won't hear this, but may see it on a recording, for your kind comments about this afternoon. Thank you to all of you who have persisted with this. We've got a range of events left over the summer. All of those events are on our website. And if those of you want to find out a bit more about the employer audit, we are providing a number of briefs again over the summer. But thank you so much. I'd like to thank our speakers, Martin from Fliers, thank you so much. And Anthony, thank you for giving us that rich picture on apprenticeships. And thanks to the back office team from the 5% Club for all you've done. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who has been here this afternoon. There's been lots of stuff passed around on the Q&A. Hopefully you've got the links there, and actually a recording of this will be sent to all of you, so you've got that for point of reference. But thank you all so much for your attendance, and enjoy the next 27 of the bank holidays as they unfold over the summer. Thank you so much.